Good evening, everybody, and welcome to my usual Tuesday night Facebook Live. But today it's Wednesday. Change of plan this week because yesterday was a special day in our family as my daughter had her graduation. So yeah, unusual, I know, for me to do this on a Wednesday. I try and always stick to my usual 6 o'clock Tuesday night slot as much as I can throughout the entire year. But this week it's a Wednesday and it's also just after 6:30 as well. Now, many of you know that my aim and mission in life is to provide really useful information that's really helpful for you to live a healthy life, and to provide that as simply as possible, simple explanations, because sometimes information out there about nutrition and lifestyle and digestion is just so complicated. And tonight's topic, I think, is particularly pertinent with regards to trying to put across something in simple terms that can be quite complex to understand. And certainly when I was learning about this, I found it quite complex, but the more I've studied it and come across clients with this and looked at ways to help clients with this, I certainly have a very good understanding now, as much as we can do about this condition. And my other passion in life is about good digestion and good gut health. That is my area of expertise in practice these days, although I see clients with other conditions as well. So I thought I'd do a series around digestion and gut health. And tonight I'm starting with SIBO, and I'm going to explain in hopefully simple terms exactly what SIBO is. And it's in two parts because it is quite complex and I'm trying to put it across in simple terms. I thought I'd split it into two parts. So tonight is exactly what is SIBO. Is SIBO a new type of IBS? And where does IBS fit into this picture of SIBO? And what on earth am I talking about when I say SIBO? And next week, I'm going to come on and talk about how I assess for people with SIBO and different methods and things that you can put in place for yourself, protocols that I use with clients, some things you can take away and put into practice yourself, and sometimes it can need a little bit more hand-holding through this with a little bit more expertise. So I am going to look at my notes. I have written a blog about this each week now. I try and write a blog. The blog goes on my website. This turned into my video on my Peyton Principles YouTube channel, and also for my podcast. So I'm going to look at my notes that I've written for my blog about this, and this will be on my website as well. Now, SIBO seems to be the buzzword in digestive health terms. Clients come to me suspecting they've got SIBO. The medical profession and GPs, it's probably not something that they know much about, if at all. They might not understand what SIBO is. Gastroenterologists, if you get that far, if you're seeking further advice, should have a bit of an understanding about SIBO these days and may look to do some tests, which I may not think is the best test out there, and is testing the best way to look at this, and that will come on to that next week. Now, SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So I'll just say that again, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, when we look at the anatomy and physiology of the gut, we swallow food, food goes to the stomach. The next section, which is a really big area, is the small intestines. It's about 20 feet long. It's that bit, if you ever look at a diagram of the digestive function and the anatomy and physiology of a body, it's the bit that looks a bit like spaghetti going across the middle and zigzagging backwards and forwards, because in reality, that's what it's like inside. We've got this area that bends around on itself that's about 20 foot long, and it's called the small intestines. And from that feeds into the large intestine, also known as the colon and the bowel, and that's the area that we'll come on to in a bit more detail with regards to bacteria. So small intestinal, that's the area between the stomach and the colon. bacterial overgrowth. And so what we're talking about here is an area, the small intestines, that's got a lot of bacteria. And the bacteria that we find in this thing called SIBO is bacteria that shouldn't be living there. It's not wanted. It's bacteria that we don't want anywhere in the gastrointestinal tract at all. And we certainly don't want it living in the small intestines. The small intestines is not an area that's designed to have a lot of bacteria. Now, the symptoms that are very, very common for people with SIBO really overlaps with IBS, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing, and I'll explain why. So the typical symptoms of somebody with SIBO is bloating that can start either several minutes, even up to 3 hours after eating a meal. People can feel really, really distended with bloating. It can be extremely uncomfortable. It can cause excruciating pain. It's so uncomfortable that some people and clients of mine have come to me because they are having to take painkillers for it. They're taking painkillers because they're in so much pain, but they haven't yet had a diagnosis or an understanding of what may be causing it. So you've got this common symptom of bloating and distension, and it can be very uncomfortable or it can be very painful. Alongside that, people get wind, they can also get burping, they can feel nauseous, and they can either get diarrhea, constipation, or it can go between a mixture of the two. These symptoms are just dreadful to be living with. Who wants to be living with symptoms like this? But the problem is getting resolution, or in the first place, getting even a diagnosis that can lead you towards possible resolution of those symptoms. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, but that sounds to me like IBS. And you're right, because those are very common IBS, irritable bowel syndrome symptoms. So where do the two fit together in this modern world? Because SIBO is a relatively new term, a new understanding of what's going on in the gut, a new diagnosis. Where do the two fit together? Well, you're right, IBS does have all those symptoms related to it, or one or more of those symptoms related to it. And what SIBO is actually a factor that causes those symptoms. So IBS can be those symptoms that may or may not be caused by SIBO, i.e. your IBS, those symptoms may or may not be caused by bacteria that's living in the small intestines. So that's where the overlap between IBS and SIBO arises from. Now, in my world, I am not so interested initially in a diagnosis or in a client's suspected view of what is going on. In my world, I am interested in the symptoms and having as much information about those symptoms. I ask a huge number of questions. I really drill down with clients and trying to understand when and where and why and when it started and what was going on in their lives, because there can be lots of different reasons why we can end up with this discomfort, which may or may not be caused by SIBO. So I think it's really important at this point to talk a little bit about the gut bacteria. So the microbiome, the human gut microbiome, these are trillions and trillions of flora, predominantly bacteria, but we also have yeast living there. We can have different viruses. We can have parasites living there as well. But predominantly it's made up of bacteria, trillions of them. In fact, so many now that we understand today that we've got 10 times the cells, flora, gut flora, as we have cells in our body. And I truly, truly believe that it's the gut bacteria that's controlling our health overall. And that's a topic for another day, and I've spoken about before. Now, these bacteria should be residing in the colon, that's the large intestines. But for some reason, these bacteria manage to find their way. The word is called translocating. They either find their way back from the colon into the small intestines, or they're managing to survive coming through with our food, and we do get pathogens and bacteria with our food and we swallow them, and it may sound awful, but that's the fact of life. And I'll explain why the bacteria end up sticking in the small intestines and decide they're going to take residence there, and they don't move on from there. So we can either have them coming back up from the colon, or they're coming through and they sort of stay put, which is not what we want. So these trillions of bacteria, so most of them, yes, they are going to be in the large intestines. No, they may not all be good ones. We do know so much now to know that some symptoms still are in the colon and are not causing a good environment, but some of these bacteria are living in the small intestines. Now, what happens if they are there is they start to feed off our food. The small intestines is an area where we digest our food and we absorb that food and those nutrients into our bloodstream. And then what passes on through there into the colon should be just the waste and the fibre. Now, if you've got food coming through in the small intestines, and you've got bacteria there, you've actually got fuel and food that bacteria may decide to feed off. And they're going to have a real party with that. They're going to think that's fantastic. They're going to feed off different types of carbohydrates and sugars, and they're going to create gas and other toxins and other compounds. And that's what can give rise to all these really uncomfortable symptoms that you may experience if it is truly SIBO. So why do these bacteria end up living there? What is going on? Now, as I said, we swallow pathogens and bacteria all the time. The stomach should be highly acidic to stop the bacteria surviving. It should kill off that acid environment in the stomach, should be killing off that bacteria. And it won't always kill off everything. And if you're a little bit low in stomach acid, that can be one of the problems. So you've got bacteria coming through. It may not all have been killed off with the stomach acid. And the other big problem with SIBO, if it truly is SIBO, is this problem with what we call motility. There should be this big sweeping action that takes place after we've eaten a meal. And we've got this contraction and sweeping action. It should sweep away all the debris from the stomach and along through the small intestines and passing it onwards and down into the colon. But for some people, this motility action becomes very sluggish and very slow, enabling this bacteria, if it hasn't all been killed off in the stomach, to take residence and survive and thrive. And then, of course, you give it the food. Not only does that give you the symptoms, but you're giving it more food to survive and thrive and grow, we just don't want that at all. So this poor motility is a real problem. It's one of the main reasons for SIBO. And it is complex, and it isn't the only reason. So when I'm looking at clients' case histories, and I'm trying to always look for the root causes, I'm trying to join up the dots for different things that are going on in a client's presenting symptoms and in their history. And some of the things that I will be looking for, I'm looking for signs of chronic stress. I'm looking for signs of low stomach acid. Have they been taking stomach acid suppressant medication or over-the-counter medication like Gaviscon that's going to interfere with stomach acid production and enough stomach acid to be killing off those pathogens? I'm looking at other long-term medications that can also influence what's going on and affect this motility. I'm also looking for things like traveller's diarrhea and food poisoning that's going to start to affect the bacterial balance that's going on in the gut. Use of antibiotics is another big one for me because that's also affecting motility and the overall gut microbiome composition. Abdominal surgery and adhesions is really affecting the ability for microbes to start to thrive and survive in the wrong place. Or it's not just to do with the stomach, but other abdominal surgery you may have had. If you've got endometriosis, it can cause a problem. If you've had other bowel surgery, it can cause a problem. I'm also looking at your pattern of eating. We'll go on to talk about this next week. Are you a frequent eater? Do you eat late at night? Do you eat early in the morning? You know, what is your pattern of eating over the course of the day? This can give rise and give me little signs that may be causing some of those symptoms. And I'm looking at your food choices. These are all really, really important signs that I'm looking out for when I take a client's case history. So join me next week, because I think I've spoken long enough about exactly what SIBO is. I hope you understand that. If you're watching this live or watching on catch up, do let me know if you've got any questions from this. So anything that I've just said to you that isn't really making sense, because I'm sure if it's not making sense to you, there'll be others that are feeling in exactly the same way as you. So do drop me a note. Don't worry about, don't be embarrassed to ask me. That's what I'm here for. Do ask me if it doesn't make sense to you. But join me next week, which will be back to my usual 6 p.m. Tuesday night slot, which I think is the 3rd of August next week. And next week, I'm going to be talking more about these causes. I'm going to be looking more at the causes, how we can test for it, how we can start to diagnose. I'm not a doctor, but how we can assess things ourselves to say, well, could that well be SIBO? And therefore, from that, what things can we do to really, really help to overcome SIBO, which isn't always straightforward straight away and can take several attempts to get right. So please join me next week for part 2 and have a lovely week, everybody. Take care. Bye.